Kyoto, 1336. A general who once burned down his own government to put an emperor on the throne now marches to tear that same emperor down, with the brother who once talked him out of becoming a monk riding beside him. Who was Ashikaga Takauji? In 1333, he burned down the government he served. 3 years later, he did it again, to the emperor who replaced it. How does betrayal build a 235-year shogunate? Ashikaga Takauji was born in 1305 into one of the most senior warrior families in the Kamakura shogunate. The Ashikaga were a branch of the Minamoto, kin to the clan that had founded the shogunate itself. Gokenin, vassals bound by oath to the shogun's government, which by then was controlled behind the scenes by the Hojo regents. For his entire adult life, Takauji served that arrangement without apparent complaint, a capable commander from a family that had every reason to defend the system that gave it status. Then, an exiled emperor changed everything he understood about where his loyalty belonged. Emperor Go-Daigo had plotted twice to overthrow the Hojo and rule Japan directly, and twice he had failed. His first conspiracy exposed in 1324, his second crushed in 1331, after which he was captured and exiled to the island of Oki in 1332. But loyalist holdouts kept fighting in his name, led by the monk prince Morinaga and the warrior Kusunoki Masashige, who held mountain fortresses the shogunate could not take. In the spring of 1333, Go-Daigo escaped his island exile and raised his banner again on the mainland. The Kamakura shogunate ordered its armies west to crush him once and for all, and gave command of one force to Ashikaga Takauji. Takauji marched west under Hojo orders and never reached the enemy he was sent to destroy. Somewhere on the road, he opened secret contact with the emperor's loyalists, and in June 1333, he turned his army around and attacked the shogunate's own headquarters in Kyoto, the Rokuhara compound, burning it to the ground. 2 weeks later, in the east, the warlord Nita Yoshisada stormed Kamakura itself, and the Hojo regent died there with hundreds of his clansmen. The government Takauji had served his whole life was gone in little more than a fortnight, and he had personally struck one of the fatal blows against it. Go-Daigo returned to Kyoto and began what became known as the Kenmu Restoration, an attempt to rule Japan directly as emperor for the first time in centuries, without a shogun standing between him and his subjects. Court nobles who had contributed nothing to the fighting received rich estates. Warriors who had risked their lives got promises and paperwork. Takauji, who had done more than almost anyone to bring down the old regime, was not made shogun. That title went to Go-Daigo's own son, Prince Morinaga, who distrusted Takauji openly. Across the warrior class, the goodwill of victory began quietly curdling into resentment. In 1335, remnants of the Hojo clan rose up and seized Kamakura in a sudden rebellion. Takauji asked the court for permission to march east and put it down, and, impatient or unwilling to wait for an answer that might not come, he left before it arrived, already calling himself shogun, a title the court had not yet granted him. He crushed the rebellion in weeks. Then he stayed in Kamakura, the old shogunate's capital, and began granting land to his own soldiers as rewards, exactly as a shogun would, without asking Kyoto's permission at all.
Go-Daigo declared Takauji a rebel and sent Nita Yoshisada, the same commander who had destroyed Kamakura 2 years before, to march east and destroy him as well. Takauji's response was strange for a man about to found a shogunate. He shaved his head, withdrew to a temple, and announced he would take Buddhist vows rather than raise a sword against his own emperor. It was his younger brother Tadayoshi and his retainer Ko-no-Moro Nao who talked him out of it, warning that surrender now meant execution, not forgiveness. Reluctantly, Takauji picked up his sword again, this time against the throne itself.
At Hakone-Takenoshita in early 1336, Takauji's forces met Nita Yoshisada's imperial army in the mountains southwest of Kamakura and broke it decisively. He did not stop to consolidate. Within weeks, he was marching west along the same road he had once taken as a loyal Kamakura commander, this time at the head of an army moving on the emperor's own capital. In February 1336, he took Kyoto. It did not last. Kitabatake Akie, a young loyalist general who had raced down from the north with a fresh army, drove Takauji out of the city and very nearly ended him. Takauji fled south to the island of Kyushu with what remained of his army, a defeated rebel with more enemies than followers. It should have finished him. Instead, over the following weeks, warrior houses across Kyushu, many with old grievances against Go-Daigo's court, began rallying to his banner instead of hunting him down. At the Battle of Tatarahama near Hakata, his rebuilt forces crushed a loyalist army sent to finish the job. By early summer 1336, the man who had been running for his life 3 months earlier commanded the largest army in western Japan. In July 1336, Takauji's army met the loyalist forces at the Minato River near modern Kobe in the battle that decided everything. The imperial army was commanded by Kusunoki Masashige, the finest general Go-Daigo had, a man who reportedly advised retreat and negotiation and was overruled by the court. He fought anyway, was surrounded, and took his own life on the battlefield rather than be captured, becoming, in the centuries that followed, the single most celebrated loyalist in Japanese history. Takauji had just defeated and effectively created Japan's ultimate symbol of unwavering imperial loyalty. With Kusunoki dead and the loyalist army broken, Takauji entered Kyoto for the second time in 5 months, this time to stay. Go-Daigo's court could not hold the city against him, and the emperor who had once denied Takauji the title of shogun now had no army left capable of stopping him from taking whatever he wanted. Takauji did not execute Go-Daigo or seize the throne himself. He had no claim to it and no interest in ruling as emperor. What he wanted was a different kind of throne entirely, one occupied by someone who owed him everything. In September 1336, Takauji installed a rival emperor on the throne, Komyo, from a different branch of the imperial family that the Kamakura shogunate had once used to check Go-Daigo's own line. It was an audacious act,
a vassal deciding by force who Japan's emperor would be, and it split the imperial house itself in two. Takauji had spent 3 years fighting in the name of restoring the emperor's authority. He now used that same authority to create an emperor he controlled completely.
Go-Daigo refused to accept his own deposition. He slipped out of Kyoto a few months later with the imperial regalia, the sword, mirror, and jewel that made an emperor legitimate, and fled south into the mountains of Yoshino, where he declared Komyo's enthronement a fraud and proclaimed himself the only true emperor of Japan. For the next 56 years, 2 rival imperial courts stood at war with each other, north and south, each claiming to be the real one. It began with one general's decision about which emperor deserved his loyalty.
In 1338, Emperor Komyo formally granted Takauji the title he had wanted since the day the old shogunate fell. Sei Taishogun, Commander-in-Chief against the barbarians, the office that made him Japan's supreme military ruler. 2 years earlier, he had already issued the Kenmu Code, 17 articles setting out how his new government would be run, deliberately echoing the founding principles of the Kamakura shogunate he had helped destroy. The Ashikaga shogunate was born, headquartered eventually in Kyoto's Muromachi district, close enough to the throne he had built to watch it at all times.
The war did not end with a title. Go-Daigo's southern court kept fighting from Yoshino, and loyalist generals kept dying for a cause that had already lost the capital. Takauji spent much of the next 2 decades not consolidating peace, but fighting to hold what he had taken, all while formally serving an emperor of his own creation. It was, in its way, the same balancing act his entire career had required. Obedience to the throne, combined with a readiness to override it completely, whichever the moment seemed to demand. The greatest threat to Takauji's rule did not come from Yoshino. It came from inside his own family. In 1350, a bitter split between his brother Tadayoshi, the same man who had once talked him out of becoming a monk, and his chief retainer Ko no Moronao, exploded into open civil war within the Ashikaga camp itself. Takauji sided against his own brother, defeated him, and Tadayoshi died in Kamakura in 1352, very possibly poisoned on his brother's orders. The man who had broken faith with an emperor lived out his last years having also destroyed the brother who once saved his cause. For most of the 6 centuries that followed, Japanese history treated Ashikaga Takauji as its principal villain. Confucian scholars of the Edo period and nationalist historians of the Meiji and wartime era held him up against Kusunoki Masashige as the negative example, the vassal who broke his oath to the throne against the vassal who died for it. Statues of Kusunoki were erected outside the imperial palace. For a long time, almost no public monument to Takauji stood anywhere in Japan. The founder of a shogunate that ruled for 235 years spent most of the centuries that followed remembered as a traitor. Modern historians read him differently. not as a simple traitor, but as a warrior repeatedly forced to choose between two competing loyalties: to an emperor who had stopped rewarding the men who fought for him, and to the retainers who depended on him for their own survival. Contemporaries described him as strikingly generous, quick to forgive defeated enemies, and uneasy with his own ambition, even as he acted on it. He was, by nearly every account, at least two different men, and Japan spent 600 years deciding it only had room to remember one of them.
Next time on Samurai Chronicles, a castellan given an impossible order: hold a castle with under 2,000 men against an army of 40,000, buying his lord the weeks he needed to turn his own army around. He knew from the start that neither he nor his men would survive. He held anyway, for over a week, so that Tokugawa Ieyasu could win the war that made him shogun. This is the last stand of Torimoto Tada at Fushimi Castle.
Ashikaga Takauji turned on the government that raised him and on the emperor he had fought for, and founded a shogunate that ruled Japan for 235 years. Subscribe to Samurai Chronicles for a new story from Japanese history every single day.